Welcome to the very first annual Wherefore Art Thou Book Awards, or what I've affectionately decided to call the Wherefories. I read about 100 books in 2024, depending on how you want to count it. I had some books that I counted as one that could have been three, four that could have been one, whatever. The number doesn't really matter. The most important thing is that the number is big, and that's because I like to read. And I like to read a lot, and I like to rack up those stats. I created a few categories, and I'm going to talk about it in this very fun, new, and special way that definitely has never been done before, and in one that might be a little bit more fun for me than it is for you, my little captives. And I'm not talking about you, viewer at home. I'm talking to the carefully selected people from different demographic groups I have chained up in my basement, cask of Amontillado style. They're currently watching my videos to boost the algorithm to certain demographics. So far, not working, but I'm going to keep trying. So if you see any weird comments, just know it's probably from them. The last thing I would want to do is infringe upon their free speech. Just as a forewarning, my reading was dominated by literary fiction and the like, because that is what I like to read, not because I'm any more smart than you, romance readers. I say humbly and untruthfully. Also, no award for best book. That's ridiculous. I've got another Sublime video coming out where I go through my top books of the year, so why would I spoil that beautiful video for you? I recommend subscribing to this channel just so you can see it when it comes out on your feed. But this video is for the fun and the dumb. I'll let you decide whether the direction of that sentence was pointed towards the awards or the viewer. The first award, of course, goes to me for distinguished effort in abandonment with 15 DNFs in 2024, which is like my largest ever. Wow, I couldn't have done it without you, shitty books. Now, as much as I could pile on the accolades on myself, no more awards for me as per Academy decision. So let's just start with the objective before getting to the subjective. So the biggest monster award for the longest book I read goes to Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, which is translated from the Spanish by Walter Starkey, which clocks in at around 1,052 pages, which is not actually that big, and I'm a little ashamed of myself. We could do better. It's really two books squished into one. The first half was amazing. It's got these really funny, ridiculous, great characters. It's clumsily written, of course. It needs a little editing, perhaps, but it's otherwise a really great, rompy story. The second half is written 10 years later, and while it's technically part of the same book, it's a very different style. It's more amusing. He clearly tries to be a little bit more conventional, and it's sort of weighed down by a lot of these distractions, like this beef with this other writer, etc. I didn't laugh as much out loud as the first half. Still worth reading both halves, I feel, at least to get closure upon the story. All the little asides for poetry, the references to the book within the plot of the book itself, the tangential side stories, a fourth wall kind of breaking things were great fun, especially for a book written in the time of Jesus. It's a great book. I recommend reading it. Now, the tiniest widow baby award that isn't poetry or part of our multi-work collection or any other reason, it goes to, wow, it looks like it's almost a tie. At 92 pages, we have Hiroko Oyamada's The Hole, which is translated from the Japanese by David Boyd. It's a strange little book. It's about a listless woman quitting her job and moving in with her husband out in the countryside next to his parents. It's deliberately strange. It's supposedly about the role of women in Japanese society, but it certainly cultivated a pretty uncomfortable, unnerving atmosphere, but I'm not sure if it did more than that for me. I liked it, didn't love it. I appreciate the weirdness of it all, but weirdness for weirdness sake, not my thing. Others would probably love this book. In fact, others do love this book. I've seen plenty of love for this book online, so you might too. And then second, Clarice Lispector's The Hour of the Star. Look at this bomb cover, by the way. It clocks in at about 95 pages if you count the introduction and the notes, which I do. This is my first Lispector, probably will not be my last. This was quite enjoyable. It centers on Macabea, a young adult in Brazil that is seemingly depressed or at least a little lost. She dates an abusive man. The character is really well done. The style is very unique, special. I really felt like a strong author voice here. I like this quite a bit. And I thought she did a great job of capturing the life of someone in a really short time. Even the beginning part where the male I believe it's a male narrator. It's been a little bit since I've read this. They addressed us directly about like philosophy and their writing style, etc. That was really good too. I wasn't really sure how I was supposed to feel after reading it, but like given time, I've actually really come to think about it a lot more, and it's gone like up in my book from there. Just as a forewarning, I'm gonna try to do like a bronze, silver, gold style scenario for these awards because I feel like it. But not every book gets a bronze, or not every category gets a bronze. Speaking of strange, let's pass out awards for our wettest, wildest, weirdest books of the year. And let's start with The Radiance of the King by Kamara Lay, which is translated from the French by James Kirkup. Bronze Award. It's really a Kafka-esque tale situated in Africa with collections of really weird characters, bizarre motives, and a foolish dude who continues to stumble towards downfall because he is unable to recognize the relative like worthlessness of his white skin color in Africa. It's really, really great. Surprisingly great. But certainly not for everyone. It's as odd as it is impressive, and it's structured really weirdly, but I loved it. In silver, we have Tarjei Vesaas's Spring Night, translated from the Norwegian by Kenneth G. Chapman. The plot surrounds a young boy and his sister. They're left alone. Their parents are someplace else, and then a group of strangers. The wife of one of them is just about to give birth, and they frantically like come up to the door, request a place to stay for the night. And the interactions between characters, which is deliberately like a little eccentric, but certainly written in like a really weird way, just like lingers on the weirdness too much for me. The communication between the characters is like very, very odd. And I still don't know how to feel about this novella overall. I liked it, but I think I didn't love it. In gold, we have Vladimir Sorokin's Ice Trilogy, which is translated from the Russian by Jamie Gambrell. It's conceptually strange with a strange plot from start to finish. The 3 books consist of attempts by a blonde and blue-eyed cult, which is magically inspired by this hunk of special ice situated in Siberia, to recruit new members. And the way they do that is they slam this ice really, really hard against someone's chest, which is attached to a hammer. And then from there, they're like awakened and inspired to join this cult. It's like very brutal and crude and vulgar and uncomfortable, but it's very creative. I'm glad I got like a little taste of Sorokin. Well, actually quite a big taste. This is like over 700 pages. But I wasn't so much a fan of like the writing style. It seemed very stilted. And often the like ridiculous plot seemed more at the whim of the author to just write something while writing it and not to like really focus on telling the story in the best way. I think the middle book of the 3, Ice, was by far the best, and perhaps could have just been read alone without the other 2. I think that was the first one he wrote. Then he wrote the first book in the trilogy, Bro, and then the last, which is 23,000. And you can really tell that was the progress because he irons out some of the technical details about the ice stuff later on. Anyway, for our next award category, we have Best Cover of the Year. And in bronze, we have our friend Becky Chambers with A Psalm for the Wild-Built. It's a somewhat benign, didactic, cozy sci-fi book about a robot and a sexually very open monk who's all right. But the cover's really cozy and nice and really fits the vibes. It's got all these colors. I'm a fan. For silver, Elisa Shua-Dusupin's Winter in Sokcho, which is translated from the French by Anissa Abbas Higgins, which is delightfully situated horizontally within this space of this salmon pink color, which is quite visually appealing to me. And finally, our first repeat, The Hole by Hiroko Oyamada, with its beautiful, plot-relevant pattern of grass. Thanks, New Directions. You can't have a best cover of the year without a worst cover of the year. So, hot take coming. Bronze goes to the garish, loud, and annoyingly covered Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I got to see her in person. She seems like a nice lady. Cover design, while instantly recognizable, nonetheless hurts my eyes. What might be considered sort of a silly choice, you have Isaac Asimov's Second Foundation, which not only pisses me off because it doesn't match my other covers, which are the older editions, because I didn't buy carefully. But also because it just looks like an iPhone background. You had such a nice chance to switch it up with the TV show and create like a nice real modern cover, and then you just get like this Windows screensaver. Lame. However, I am grateful that they did not just like put the real life human actors on the cover. Have not seen the show, and this book is kind of, I don't know. I don't understand why people would read this series and think it's super overrated. Absolutely blowing the other two out of the water is Frank Rooney's Courts of Memory, which gets the gold medal. I was upside down. I thankfully do not have a dust jacket for this book because I don't think I'd be able to visually look at it. I mean, holy shit. This is bad by even like old-timey shit cover standards. And I'm just going to let you sit and stew in this image a little bit. All right, that's enough. Next category, fattest disappointment of the year awards. We have to start with John Steinbeck's Sweet Thursday, unfortunately, which earns the bronze medal. To create a sequel to Cannery Row, which I loved so much, and have it be so stinky, that sucks, man. You didn't need to write it, John. You have so many other books. Let this one go. In silver is, sadly, Eliza Shua Disciplin's Winter in Sokcho. A bad book? No. Absolutely not. This is a fine book. But the way this book is talked about, I thought I was going to fall in love. My expectations were sky high, and I was pumped to see this book on sale. And I wanted to like it so badly. But I just didn't. The romance that was barely there kind of held my interest, but not much. And I don't think any of the familial and boyfriend relationships were anything other than like mildly notable. And I got no sense of setting really, or her character. And it just felt like there was a lot of overcooked, like wet noodles here. And not overcooked in the sense that like the author went over it too much, but overcooked in the sense that it's super floppy and about to fall apart. I was counting on like really something special here, and I think when the ending just wraps, it just feels like a TV show that got canceled by Netflix. It just ends. I still will definitely read more open letter books in the future, and I know this is like their best-selling title, perhaps for a reason. Maybe some of the more obscure titles would be better books for me. But this just, made me a little, And then my biggest disappointment of all was Margaret Cavendish's The Blazing World and Other Writings, which I think is like it seems like potentially an odd choice. But everything I've read about Margaret Cavendish, her life seems so fascinating, and a fiercely independent woman writing what she wanted to write and not giving a fuck about what woman's place in society is supposed to be. And she seemed to get nothing but encouragement from her husband, and she seemed really, really cool, and I want to read her biography. And this book, potentially one of the earliest examples of science fiction ever written by a woman, I was like, sign me up. And yet, the 3 books collected into this one, I had difficulty making it through them. Annoying grammar, annoying punctuation, which I think was even like translated slightly to make it more accessible into modern English, but still like really annoying to read, and just like weak storylines that were like coherent in their own way, but I don't know. Then she like slots in her own grievances about her husband's property loss, and then she has like her own interpretations of philosophy that felt more grating than thoughtful. And there wasn't really anything of merit here to highlight. It seems like she just like wrote some weird stuff down and then made them into a story. I don't know. I wanted this to be good, or at least entertaining, so badly, and it just let me down. What about mildest disappointment? So here's a book that I talked about at length in the previous video, William Faulkner's A Fable, which I did not finish. It won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. And I've since read A Sound and the Fury, and I was like absolutely spellbound by it. But this is terrible. It's a difficult read, and it's just genuinely, gratingly difficult. Not difficult in like a, ooh, you have to unsolve this, uncover this mystery riddle, etc. No, it's just like, what is even happening to the characters in this story? You can't even tell. He doesn't give anybody a name, so you're like, who is he? Who is them? Could not tell. It's tiring. And then the story wasn't good. Like, the plot was drab. Even if you were able to figure everything out, it's just like a really drab book. And war is just like such a dynamic thing to happen, just put it lightly. And to not even come close to capturing the feeling of what war feels like, unlike so many other authors, it's just like, what's the point of this, man? And the allegory is just so obvious from the very beginning. It doesn't do much. I mean, there's a giant cross on the cover. What were you expecting to happen? The reason why it's like still like mildest is that I didn't really have high expectations for the book after reading reviews, or before reading the book and reading reviews before reading the book. But I thought I'd at least be able to get through it and get something out of it, especially since it won both awards. But no, this is a bronze. Silver. The way people talk about this book, it's like they've discovered Jesus in the manger. It is a very bro book. Like, people who read a lot of like fantasy, especially men, and then they read like this book and then they're like, wow, this changed my life. It's definitely a certified dude book, though I know a lot of women like it as well. It's like guys who just read Brandon Sanderson, and it's like the peak of their reading, and then they read this and they're like, oh my god. And it's a good book. It's Cormac McCarthy's The Road. The atmosphere is incredible. There's so much to like about it, but the story, it just so pales in comparison, literally, to the only other Cormac McCarthy book I've read, which is All the Pretty Horses. So I was feeling like, oh, I'm going to get that 2.0, except even better, the way that people talk about this. I just didn't get any of that. The movie's good. The movie's pretty good. I think the movie's as good as the book is. And then finally, for the mildest disappointment, was Becky Chambers' A Psalm for the Wild Built. People I don't trust and people I do trust praised this book both, so that made me suspicious. If everyone likes it, I often think maybe I won't. But the effusiveness of the praise and the way people were talking about how they like changed their life, I was like, maybe. I don't mind a cozy book in theory, I guess. Just it seemed more aligned with books like The Alchemist than a book of like science fiction or a literary book. It seemed like just a really lame, obvious lesson disguised as a book. There's some cool ideas in here, some neat science fiction stuff in there, but it seemed mostly to be about atmosphere than anything else. Our character didn't need to be like this sexual T-monk on a moon with a weird system of gods. It could have literally just been like a 13-year-old walking down the street with a dog or a friend. So there you go, Becky. Mildest disappointment, gold. For the biggest surprise of the year, which is our next award, I give the bronze to Don Quixote, which I had no idea would be this fun. It's written like a billion years ago. Books that old are generally pretty lame. But no, this really, really holds up and is genuinely still funny today. In silver, I have a book with this very different, but has some similar logic here. My Life in the Bush of Ghosts by Amos Tutuola. It's a fantastic blend of this like realism with Nigerian folktale. It's written in this like very blunt, abrupt style, and it's just like up my alley for these weird books. The plot centers around this boy that is escaping gunfire and like all these warlords coming into their village, and then like somehow slips into this realm called the Bush of Ghosts, which is sort of a woodsy dimension where spirits and juju and magic are like reigning forces. And episode after episode, he encounters this like magical weird thing, and then looks to survive in this strange world just to get back to his own one day. It comes with the Palm White Drinkard in the same edition, which is similar, though I don't think it's as good. Liked both, though. Finally, in gold, I have Milton Lott's The Last Hunt. Look at this cover. It was published in 1954. Do you think this Western is a delicate exploration of the death of the buffalo and the Native Americans of the Midwest at the hands of white, lawless settlers? No way. It's not perfect. The beginning of the book drags much too long before getting interesting, but once it does, it like hits you hard. This was just like really well done. It's a difficult to find book for like under 20 bucks. So I hope someone reissues it one day and then other people can read it because it's genuinely a hidden gem. So I had the category of mildest disappointment. So why don't we do mildest surprise? So William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. I already mentioned it, but I read it after A Fable, which I did not like. So I was really wary about it. Even though it's like a classic, a celebrated book, I was like, maybe I just don't like Faulkner, blah, 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 blah. But no, this is a very difficult book in its own right, but it's definitely comprehensible. It's much more enjoyably done. So much so that I was entranced. It's broken up into 3 different parts, or I guess 3 or 4 different parts. And it chronicles the decay of this family through each unique voice. And each section gets it's like its own perspective. And the beginning starts with this like fragmented memory of Benji, which is like this mentally disabled man, which creates this like wonderful interlocking of narrative and memory. And it's like a little hard to keep track of which is which. Generally, you can follow along based on who's handling him at the time of where it sits in the chronology. Or there's an online guide, of course, if you're lazy. It is difficult to read that first section, but it becomes more linear in following sections. I wouldn't say easier, but linear certainly. So don't give up right away if you're in that first section and you're like, this sucks. Definitely a mild surprise in the sense that I'm really happy that I really liked it. In silver, I have F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Now, I've disliked almost every adaptation of this story I've ever seen, and I don't really like this story. And I think I'm up to 3 adaptations now that I've seen. Whatever. I've heard a lot of negative things about the book itself from other people, which is why it took me until this time, this year, to read it. Though a lot of those people were basically just like people who had to read it in high school and then like are not readers, so I guess I should have dismissed them immediately. Even with me not liking this overarching like plot of the story, the book is nearly perfect. It's beautifully written. And Fitzgerald is so efficient with his words, and you get a picture of every character so clearly and easily. The emotional swells are gorgeous. It's just an immaculate little story, and the first and last lines are perhaps among the best openers and closers of any book of all time. And it is certainly a classic for a reason. And if the last time you read this was in high school and you're older now, definitely give this another shot just to zip through it. I mean, it's a tiny little book. Now, in gold, I'm not awarding it to any specific book, but rather a writer. I'm giving it to Emma Cline, which I wasn't expecting to be among the books I enjoyed this year. I'm surprised that both The Girls and The Guest, 2 TGs, they're both commercial fiction, and they're both definitely written that way, but as good as it can get, if that makes sense. They're not at the very top of my list, but really 2 enjoyable books, and enjoyable in the way that similar books just aren't. None of the brittle, like flimsy qualities of thrillers or comparable works that I've found. I think Cline has found this perfect hair-thin line here, and I will continue to read her books if and when they come out. Thankfully, I only have 2 awards to hand out for this next category. It is called My Expectations Were Low, but Holy Fuck. We have Taking Silver, Lionel Shriver's Mania, and I was among the unfortunate few to win the Goodreads contest for this book. This book seems like it was written for J.K. Rowling and J.K. Rowling alone. It is it's like they took the short story Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut and expanded it into like this shit novel. The writing is so needlessly verbose. Like, we get it. You're smart. You've taken an English class. The characters are so boring and slapdash. The author is pushing this worthless screed. It's so unnecessary that like woke is bad, but like from the left. It's so cringe, and I couldn't finish more than 20% of this because it was just bad. And giving an award to a book that I've only finished 20% of is is saying something. In any other year, there would be no book worse than Mania. However, this year my book club chose to read It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. And in an attempt to at least be able to like participate in the discussion, I listened to 50% of it, 51% of it, but could go no further. To say this was a lazy, poorly written book would be too mild of a critique compared to the garbage it was. I look at the cover, I look at the plot summary, and I'm like, wow, this sounds like shit. I read it, and I'm like, wow, this was shittier than I thought it would be. Perhaps I have a bias. You're telling me that Lily Blossom Bloom, that name, opened up a goth flower shop just on a whim. And that shitty, in a really nice part of Boston, by the way, and that shitty idea was immediately successful. It's so cringe. And that, plus the descriptions of the relative protocols of sex that they engage in, which is paired neatly, by the way, with domestic abuse, is incoherent. Like, if I can't follow along where your clothes and limbs are, like, don't write it. Also, Letters to Ellen, that aged well. This shit is dreadful. It sounds like it was written to meet a deadline, and it's truly dreadful slop. Of course, you have to have the converse, so my expectations were high and holy fuck. We've got Bronze, we've got Camarle's Radiance of the King. After reading the fairly decent The Dark Child by Lay, I was surprised to read like this much more mature, excellent work of fiction. Turns out there's some doubt whether he wrote it himself or somebody else wrote it for him, or he was just put his name on the... there's some debate about that, which I get, kind of, because none of the like Africa feeling I got from the original book, like that felt so personal and so like connected to the culture, that wasn't there in this book. It felt like more like a story about a person taking place in Africa and not someone who had like lived there. So I get it. But either way, in the end, it doesn't matter. The book was great. In silver, I have Willa Cather's My Antonia. I was expecting this to be good because of Cather's reputation, a podcast I listened to, and My Antonia's status as a classic, and a lot of people love it, but I didn't think I would enjoy it so much. It is a fantastic portrait of the edge of civilization out in the Midwest, where a group of people of all stripes are trying to survive and strive, and all of the characters are incredible, with highs and lows and expectations subverted, and Cather plays a lot with gender roles and some subtle and distinct ways. It's just really, really well done, despite the very loose framework of a plot. And finally, in gold, we have Ngugi wa Thiong'o's A Grain of Wheat. I thought I was going to like this, and I did not expect to love it. The setting is in Kenya during the struggle for Kenyan independence from Britain and their colonization, and about everything about this book is good. The story, the characters, its descriptions of the rippling impact of colonialism through the lives of the characters. In small and very large ways, it pounces upon the subtle, the nuance, but also the grand and dramatic, the tragedies, but the personal and the cultural tragedies. It's just really, really, really great. I expected this to be good, but you never know. And I thought it could have been one of those books where tragedies are just like stacked on top of one another, rather than like a work of like true artistic fiction. And I was completely wrong. This really moved me. And I've probably recommended this book to more people in real life than any other book this year. I'll call this next award Biggest Brain Growth. It doesn't have to be nonfiction. These three just happen to be so. There were definitely a couple contenders in fiction that almost made the list. These are just three not great nonfiction works that I read this year. I'll start with Bronze, and I'm not going to put it on the stand because it's so fat. But Sam Thayer's incredible field guide. This is the field guide to edible wild plants of Eastern and Central North America. I love to forage, and this is just, like, it's clunky, it's big, might be hard to haul around, but this is just like some of the most valuable, complete information in a guide I have ever seen about foraging. Not only does he use like indigenous and scientific sources together to come up with to write his entries into this field guide, but he has a lot of his own experience eating this stuff and harvesting it multiple times, so he can tell you if it's really worth harvesting or not, and how much nutrients and such you're going to get out of whatever it is he's talking about, and he eats everything like multiple times to not only test its toxicity, but to like really assess the flavor. And that's super important. Like most field guides are just regurgitating information from other sources, and wrong information, especially in this like the plant world, has a way of just sticking around because the sheer amount of information to like really collect a field guide takes years and years and years and years of work. And most people who are doing that don't want to do that. So the fact that he did, and he's like pretty much dedicated his life to this subject, creates just like a wonderful book. And his other books are wonderful too, but I only read this one this year. In silver, we have Alex Thurston's Boko Haram. Rarely do you read a book and feel like you've just exhausted all the important parts about a subject, but this one you do. It's not a captivating book in the way that it's written, but the author is so extremely knowledgeable and objective, and he's done a lot of his own research that matters a little less to me. Very good, complete book. And then finally, in gold, is this really underrated book. It was compiled by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City, and it's called Unsung, Unheralded Narratives of American Slavery and Abolition. It's a compilation of primary sources that they put together to form this book. It's just a wealth of knowledge. Of course, even in like the efforts of compilation, there will be bias, and you can tell definitely like what they were aiming for in putting this together. But these wonderful folks really illuminated some key sources on the subject, particularly those from former slaves. I mean, they really did work to collect these like really esoteric like primary sources and being able to read them directly is like such a cool thing to be able to do, especially when an expert compiles them for you. Of course, not every single like entry was as fascinating as the other, but luckily most of them were fairly short, so you could just skip to the next thing if it didn't really interest you. Our next award goes to the biggest mid, the most dead center, average mid books that I've read this year. And so I give that to, first, bronze, Toni Morrison with God Help the Child. It's perhaps her work most intensely focused on pedophilia, a subject she certainly addressed before. In fact, she addresses in her very first book, so it creates this little bookend of her career. It's just lacking a lot of the luster that makes up any of her other work, and we'll just have to give her a mulligan for this one because pretty big career, pretty well lauded career. Everything else is pretty great. Cecily Pinn's Wandering Souls earned silver. The way people talk about this book, it's like almost like it was robbed of some major literary awards, and the adoration and fawning over it was greatly disproportionate to me than the quality of the actual book, which seems more like a run-of-the-mill immigrant story with a tough life. There's nothing here that hasn't really been done before better in other ways. It's fine. It's mid. Another dual winner. We have in gold, Gabrielle Zevin's very popular Tomorrow, and Tomorrow. An endless book, frankly. I'm glad so many people enjoyed it. Even some people with good taste. Thought it was aggressively just okay. There's not one thing I can point out that's like a flaw. Everything is just tinted in beige. I think this book will be completely forgotten in 15 years, even though it's been on some like pretty prominent lists recently. I just don't have a lot to say about it, which is why it earned biggest mid. Our next category is you haven't given it the old college try. And for that, I award Tarjei Visas the bronze. After reading Spring Night, I didn't really fall in love, but people love The Birds and The Ice Palace. And I need to read at least one of those to get a handle on myself and how I feel about his work. There was a lot I liked about Spring Night. It just like wasn't what I was going for. Just didn't fall together completely like a puzzle. The second on my list, silver, is Mary Oliver. I read Dog Songs this year to my fiance because she wanted me to, and because I'm a sweet guy. I was happy to do that and make her happy. I just think that a poetry book about dogs was not something I really needed in my life, even though I love every puppy, young and old. All dogs deserve love and happiness. I'm just not sure if I wanted to read like 40 poems about dogs. So I don't consider this giving Mary Oliver a good, serious try. Probably read Devotions at some point. I don't think she'll be my favorite poet, but I definitely want to give her at least another shot. And then finally, in gold, I read The Huge Season by Wright Morris. So Wright Morris earns the award for gold for Give It the Old College Try. You can tell when an author is like really talented, but that this might not be their best work. The Huge Season is about a bunch of white college kids that drift around through life, and then there's like a tragedy in there. It's about the lost generation to some degree, and you could tell the guy can write. I just wish less of the writing was like purely observational. Like, we can completely take out that page that's like dedicated to the description of like a pretty nondescript leg, frankly. So thanks, Wright, for that. And I'll definitely be reading at least one of your other work. Our next category is You're Still on My TBR, but Consider Yourself Directed to the Back of the Line, an award given for authors I'm not rushing to come back to. And in bronze, we have Vladimir Sorokin. I think I need to take a break on him, not that I was rushing to read him anyway, because this is a pretty brutal work. I just didn't love this style. I definitely will come back to him because he's doing some cool stuff that nobody else is really doing, but I don't think I'm going to be like demanding to find his other work, if that makes sense. Elizabeth Strout's My Name is Lucy Barton is a fine, sparse little book. I was going to try to read like a bunch of her books to sort of catch up and then read like the new book that she came out with. I was like, oh, that could be a really fun project. And I like the idea of like an extended literary universe. Like, that's not really commonly done. I just came out of this one with the impression that like this was mom lit, if you know what I mean. Like, older women would gravitate towards this more than someone like me. It just felt very mild. I think I'll read more by her in the future. I mean, like, I have a bunch of her books that I got for really cheap, so I will, but I'm like not rushing out to read more. And then in gold, we have Haruki Murakami. I read Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, which is translated by Alfred Birnbaum from the Japanese. I was like long debating which of his to read first, because he's like just so captivating an author for many people. And then I settled on this one based on the description and like reviews and like trusted opinions of other people who don't even really like him. And I thought the weirdness would be a contributing factor, not a detracting one. Some of his critics are definitely right. He's terrible with women. It might be a translation thing too, but the writing was like also nothing special at all. And the idea that he sets up with the two worlds and they sort of interact with one another in a way that you're not sure how they're actually connected, that was really cool. I just wish he spent more time on like the writing parts and the plot parts. My next award is for the biggest chucklers, goofs, gaffs, and laughs. I don't audibly laugh when I read a book, but I think I've got that like little nose air puff situation down pat. I think I will say that these three books actually did make me laugh a little bit, sort of like a strangled gargoyle kind of sound. And Don Quixote almost made the list, and it would have been on the list if not for the second half. So here's a consolation prize. Our real bronze goes to Peter DeVries' Tunnel of Love, which I don't have a jacket for. An exceptionally and purposefully dumb book, but also a very witty story of a man, his wife, and his peculiar friend who is looking to adopt a child and use our narrator as a reference to the adoption group so he can adopt a child. It's definitely a little dated with its references and some of the jokes, but it's filled with witticisms that stand up to this day, and I definitely think I'll read more of his books in the future, which I was not expecting, but I did genuinely really like this book. Kingsley Amos's Lucky Gem is a genius book. I don't care what anyone says. It's constant fun, but it's really impressively written with some of the most fun turns of phrase I've ever read after building up to Jim's lecture after this whole freaking book, like hundreds of pages, and it just delivers in like the goofiest way possible. This book is such a gem, but in terms of just like laughs per minute ratio, nothing can top Garth Marenghi's Terror Tome. As a book, not very good, but as a source for like laughs, like a comedy show, great. A plot, don't think it's worth talking about. Man fucks a typewriter. I'm not usually a memoir fan, so I only read a few this year, but 2 at least were worth awarding, so fortunately both of these were quite good. So I give this silver to Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast. What a fantastic, fascinating insight into all these different famous authors at the time, which he was just chilling with while he was writing A Sun Also Rises. And also all that information about Hemingway's process and just like the general atmosphere of like this post World War One literature, and then like the people. It was all great and like really tiny. Like this is like a tiny little book. I read this so quickly. And then in gold we have J.A. Baker's The Peregrine. Wow. I mean, this is just one of those books that you'll remember forever. It's simple. Man traipses around the woods in Chelmsford, England, following around like one or sometimes a pair of peregrine falcons and just like watching them do their thing, writing it down. But the way he wrote them down, just such lyricism and beauty, and just like one of those nature books that just like blows your mind. When the right author writes about nature, it's just like the best thing you've ever read. My next category is best short story. So Edith Wharton has a lot of really good stories in here. Frankly, there's not one I would say is like the best, but perhaps a contender is Her Son, where a woman in search of her missing son that she adopted out ends up finding him in Europe, or is roped into further and further drama from there. I don't think it's right for me to spoil it further, but definitely read this collection. I mean, it's really solid and there's some really great gems in there. In silver is Henry James's A Beast in the Jungle, or The Beast in the Jungle, where a man believes something calamitous is about to happen to him, good or bad, and basically puts his entire life on emotional hold, waiting for that event to happen, which includes not marrying. It's a fascinating look at like a certain character's psychology, and I just think it's really well done. And then in gold is Toni Morrison's Recitatif, which is now published on its own, accompanied by the long-winded and largely unnecessary Zadie Smith introduction, which is, I think, longer than the book itself, or the short story itself. The story is a brilliant literary experiment in examining your own bias, because we are never told the races of the two female characters beyond the fact that one is black and one is white. It's a literary experience like no other I've ever experienced before, and to think she only published one short story in her entire career, and it's like one of the best I've ever read. Very on brand. I would have an award for best short story collection, but I really only read one that I liked this year.
Oh, how could I forget you, Peter Taylor?
That goes to Edith Wharton's collected stories by default, more or less. But if I even was able to read like a few more that I did like, I think hers would still be at the top. I think I read just enough poetry to justify two collections getting awards this year for best poetry collection. In silver, I have Dora Malick's very inventive Stet, which is a collection of poetry constrained by anagrams and structure that did have some really poignant moments in a lot of confusion, but I really liked it. And there were some certain like events and certain poems in the story that I thought hit harder than others for sure. In gold, I have this collection of Emily Dickinson poems called The Essential Emily Dickinson, which was collected by Joyce Carol Oates, which I think is funny. And now it just makes me want to read like her entire bulk collection, because like this was too small, definitely not enough, but I definitely really loved it. And I feel like this is my year to like come to all these people that I'm like, especially poets that I'm like wary of, because I was like wary of poetry and like I'm wary of these like famous poets, and just like start to enjoy them. So consider this a watershed moment. And of course you can't have best poetry collections without best individual poems. So in bronze, I have Marianne Moore's sprawling nature and human poem called The Octopus, which I really liked. And next I have in this Dora Malick collection, I have After Plath Metaphors, which is actually like kind of a series of poems where she takes a Sylvia Plath poem and then anagramizes it 9 times into 9 new excellent poems. And then finally, I have Walt Whitman's candid, beautiful, earnest Song of Myself, which is just so much different than I thought it would be, and it really encouraged me to want to read the full Leaves of Grass collection. I've been missing out on Walt Whitty for so many years because I thought it was going to be really lame. But it's actually super cool and a little homoerotic. And then normally I wouldn't do this because it seems wrong, but I have to do it this year. I want to award the worst poem that I read this year to The Jesus Fridge, because what the fuck was this, Jeffrey McDaniel? This atrocity snuck its way into my email on that like poem of the day subscription that you can do. And I could not believe my eyes when I read, this is a George Floyd moment for Israelis and Palestinians. Just so bogglingly insensitive. Sorry, Jeffrey, I'm sure your other poetry is great. But this one, trash. All right, for fastest DNF. I usually don't pick up books I know I'm going to DNF immediately, but a few like sneak in there. In silver is Misha Collins's Some Things I Still Can't Tell You, which is god-awful Instagram poetry that is printed on the page. And I read one poem of that before realizing, oh, this is what this is going to be. Give it away. Winning gold is Bella Mackey's How to Kill Your Family, with a narrator that was so insufferable I turned off the audiobook within like a few seconds due to primal revulsion. Sheesh. This is not a book I could tolerate for more than a few seconds. And then, but neither of the above qualify for our next award, which is called Most Frustrating, because it has to involve some sort of buy-in in order to be frustrated by it. In silver, I have Stephen E. Ambrose's Eisenhower. It's going to be a little too big to fit on the stand. The author was like really, so Stephen Ambrose, who I actually do like his other work. I like D-Day, Citizen Soldiers, I believe, is another book I've liked by him. But he just spends so much time filleting the man. He just skipped over both major achievements and major deficiencies, and it's so long. It's like 600 pages, and yet it still feels so incomplete, which is just like, why bother? I know there's a 2-volume set, so maybe the 2 volumes is better than the 1 volume. I came away from it being like, that's it, but that pales in comparison to my mortal enemy, who wins gold, and that is Barbara Kingsolver. This is the second book I've read by her, the Poisonwood Bible. The first was Animal Vegetable Miracle, and that was definitely my most frustrating book of last year. So to have her win 2 books in 2 different years, really telling about how much she affects me. I read more than half of this, which is still like 300 pages, and it just continued to drive me more and more nuts. And I know this is a maverick opinion because I know people love this book, but beyond the lush environment, the literary novelty of so many characters having their own sections that they come back to, there's just like not anything under the hood for me. The main antagonist, the father and missionary, is cartoonishly evil. Every moral of the story is simple, fairly obvious, but Kingsolver has to hold your hand through every step of the way. You've got these wise Africans, and of course, plenty of arrogant whites, which, is how it is, but it didn't have to be so blatant. I'm sure the story was lining us up for some gut punch. Probably, I'm guessing, the youngest daughter dies of malaria, and then the mom and daughters leave the father, and maybe we have some reflecting moments after that. That's just a prediction of how it ends. I have literally no idea because I didn't even bother looking it up, and I'm not even going to bother finishing. The reason this was the most frustrating book of the year was because, my God, she has the capability, she has the chops. This woman can write. And the Congo that she describes is so incredibly vivid with the beauty and the danger and the and then she just like can't put it together into like this great story. It kind of sucks. I also DNF'd Animal Dreams this year too because like it was super slow. It was like a super slow version of this without any color, and I didn't want to bother with that. So 2 DNFs in the same year from the same author. I'm giving away all our books I have, except for, of course, Demon Copperhead, which I think I will eventually read, but I'm very, very wary. Books awarded with the fattest flop award are those for the books who completely fail to achieve their purpose and fall on their face in their progress towards the intended goal. In bronze, we have Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. The play, the best part about this book, the book it's based off of, was the slow development and the evolution over time, and condensing that, all of that, into like just one little short play just like sucked the air and joy out of it. It just like, it stinks. In silver, we have Frank Rooney's The Courts of Memory, which I've already talked about, and a book nobody has ever heard of. And of course, a book like that nobody's ever heard of and nobody else should ever read wins 2 awards. But I think, because it was super hard to tell, that this book is about the lost generation, again, and it focuses on a family, particularly a brother in that family, and his sister, secondarily. It was sort of naive and earnest, and it had this misguided sense of genuine effort. And then we meet exactly one black person, and we just throw that out the window because of the racism. There were so many elements here that could have been turned into a good book. There's a loss of masculinity due to an injury, which isn't. There's a sexism that the daughter experiences throughout her career, despite a intense, crazy amount of education, which was almost impossible to have received in the time that she did it. But that's not really explored at all. And then Rooney does nothing with both of those things, writes 600 pages, and the story just peters out with nothing. Like, what are you doing, buddy? Finally, the biggest flop of them all, we've got William Morris's News from Nowhere and Other Writings, which is a bunch of mid-poetry. It's fine. Some beautiful designs. I mean, the designs in the middle, this little like white stripe in the middle, all of those are like some beautiful patterns, but like I can go anywhere and look at patterns. And then some writings, which say very little and not a lot of time. The titular story, which is News from Nowhere, which is Utopia that he wrote, which is what I was most excited to read. And this work is a direct response to Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, which is a vision of socialism that he comes up with. And even in the News from Nowhere even has like some very similar plot beats on purpose to Looking Backward. And like a guy like goes to sleep or whatever and like wakes up in the future and like it's socialism now and he's exploring that utopia. But where it fails, it's just so goofy and unconvincing and unnecessarily long. Even this edition, this Penguin edition, which I've never seen happen before, they trim out a chunk that just doesn't add to the story at all. And Morris's like view of socialism, it's just like this very decentralized, like libertarian style socialism, which relies on an education system that basically just involves like taking kids out of school, throwing them in a tent, and then taking them out into the woods and like having them learn out in the woods. Like, first of all, does England even have any woods? Second of all, what does that teach you? Like, are you even really going to be learning like math and science like while like playing with bugs? I guess a little bit. Like once they go through this school system and they grow up, they're basically just spontaneously supposed to work together to do things like build bridges, set up farms, start museums, and it's just like voluntary. He also seems to be very against like any modern technology. I'm not talking like AI, I'm talking about like a machine. So anything that needs to be done has to be done by hand. It's absurd. Like even in the most socialist paradise that modern thinkers are aware of, like computers exist, looms exist, machines exist, like nobody is freaking sewing shirts by hand. Thank you, William Morris, for receiving the gold in biggest flop. We have come to the end. After all this time, our final awards of the night are for my category I'm calling I Don't Have Time for This Nonsense, which, if you've made it this far, perhaps you did have time for some nonsense, where I read a number of pages of a book, and I said, I know where this is going, and I don't feel like it. In bronze, we have Melissa Broder's essay collection, So Sad Today. The I don't have time for this moment came very early on when I turned over a page, and it was even more graphic sex stuff. I'm not opposed to sex, nor reading about it. I'm no Puritan. I'm just very opposed to like reading about someone's very boring, uninteresting sex life. Like, here's the rule. If some dumb burnout from high school can tell a better story about sex than the sex that you're reading about, put down the book. Francisca Melandri's Ava Sleeps, translated by Catherine Gregor from the Italian, is a family saga. But 50 pages in, nobody is interesting. And the writing is fairly flat, and there's some weird choices made here. So I flipped ahead like 50 pages, 100 pages, read a couple paragraphs, just to see if anything interesting was happening. And I'm pretty sure I flipped to someone just like making bread at a bakery, and it was a lot of writing about that, and I just decided no. Finally, in gold is Harriet Simpson Arno's The Dollmaker, an Appalachian story, a very authentic sounding Appalachian story of stack tragedies, told in a very authentic and difficult to parse accent. I asked myself, do I want to struggle to understand this Appalachian dialect for 700 pages, or feeling sad over and over and over again as tragedies continue to happen to this small family? And the answer was no. I'm sorry. So that just about wraps it up. I hope that was enjoyable for you. Thanks.